From Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, YouTube's changing things. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. UK newspaper The Observer has looked at how YouTube is transforming podcasting. The piece contains quotes from Qcode, Crowd Network and Message Heard. The Daily Mail, a UK newspaper, suggests that Spotify's podcast chart may be being manipulated to keep Meghan Markle's podcast at number one. The newspaper compares Spotify's top podcast list, which, like Apple, includes recent listener activity as a score, and their top episodes list, which doesn't. We have more information on podcast stats and how the Spotify charts actually work. The Dateline NBC Apple Podcast subscription is the fastest growing subscription ever to launch on Apple Podcasts, we're told. The show itself jumped from number 15 to number 2 in Apple's top shows trending chart. Radio analyst Adam Bowie has looked at how podcasting works in Twitter. He notes that the algorithm correctly deduced that he's a fan of Arsenal, a British football team, never mind, but also that it's trying to get him interested in WWE wrestling, which he isn't. After a social media backlash, Podcast Movement says it's putting in place policies to guide our social media and events with inclusivity, diversity and respect for all. And Radio Days Asia is about to start in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. The conference includes a track about podcasting on Wednesday and speakers including Ariel Nissenblatt, Lyndall Harris, hosts and editors from the BBC's Global News podcast, and Podnews' editor, James Cridland. That's me. And if you're a podcaster in KL and you're free on Wednesday afternoon, drop me an email, editor@podnews.net, and let me know. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. August's platform data for Buzzsprout, a podcast hosting company, shows a drop for the share of Spotify plays on its podcasts, down from 28 to 27%. Total downloads for all of Buzzsprout are up 10% month on month and up 50% year on year. On the web, Podverse, a podcast app, has launched searchable transcripts. We link to an example from the Podland podcast. Podnews podcast pages now support the podcast person tag. Many podcast hosting companies support it, including Buzzsprout, Fireside and Sounder. It's also supported in podcast apps like Podcast Guru and Podcast Addict. Newly generated Podnews podcast pages also give a blended ratings score now from Apple Podcasts, Podchaser and Podcast Addict. An example is The Daily, which we link to today. The data comes from Rephonic. Wavy looks just like Audacity, but works in your web browser. You'll find it at wavy.app, and that's Wavy spelled with 2 V's because, you know, the internet. And the OPORG user agents list for podcast apps now includes Timpy, a new search engine crawler, and a slight amendment to Podcast Guru's user agent. And in podcast news, New Day is a podcast from Lemonada Media with grief expert Claire Bidwell-Smith, sharing actions you can implement to make meaningful changes in your life and answering questions. The media podcast with Matt Deegan this week has our editor, James Cridland, that's me, as a guest. I talk about The Teacher's Pet, the trial of Chris Dawson, and its implications for true crime podcasters. The Heat 7 is a new podcast from Heat, a UK entertainment magazine, hosted by Jamie East and produced by Daft Doris. It'll provide listeners with the 7 biggest stories from the world of entertainment, showbiz, reality and social that day in under 7 minutes. Matan, Injustice of a Hanged Man is new from the BBC, exploring a shocking miscarriage of justice which led to the execution of Somali seaman Mahmoud Matan on September the 3rd, 1952. The first episode comes out on Friday. Now that another Edinburgh Fringe has come to an end, the Edinburgh Fringe Show with Ewan Spence is to showcase the stars of today by going back to their earliest adventures on the stages of the world's largest arts festival, delving into an archive of over 1,000 interviews. And the Popcorn Podcast is back for a new season, containing new release movies and associated latest news. It's hosted by Lee Livingston and movie expert Tim Ifland, and it became the #1 Australian-made new release film podcast. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.